COVID-19 has changed what business leadership looks like now and for the foreseeable future. Smart leaders are adapting their strategies to this new work environment. I would like to invite Sumit Harjani, Country Manager, India and Director Corporate Learning, Asia Pacific at Harvard Business Publishing, to speak on leadership in a post pandemic world.
Hi, everyone. Really excited to share some findings from the world of Harvard around leadership in a post pandemic world. Well, I know this topic has been spoken about and written about so much, but what we're really trying to do here through Harvard Business Review, through our collaboration with Harvard Business School and Harvard Business Publishing Corporate Learning, really try and synthesize all of that together at one place and also a little bit go beyond the truism, things that we've heard and read so much. But before I get there, let me perhaps start with a minute of introduction about who we are at the Corporate Learning Business at Harvard. Why we exist and what we are really passionate about is trying to get you the most important and provocative management and business ideas to you, ideas that matter today and tomorrow. And where do these ideas come from? I mean, the content engines is Harvard Business Review, Harvard Business School, and we are perhaps the only institute in the world which has 14 research centers whose only day job is to look for ideas that make organizations successful or have their learnings. Well, we all know just the ideas can't cut it. So, how do we frame these ideas in organizations' context and deliver it to the learners as they want it? It could be through an AI backed personalized digital learning platform or cohort based learning experiences, or hopefully very soon in better times, either at the HBS classroom in Boston or in Mumbai or even your own offices. So, really looking at best management ideas contextualized to your reality, serving it in whichever platform we deem appropriate, the right kind of design principles, the right kind of measurement strategy, and all of that coming together to serve the learner when they need it. So really, the important part of why all of us are here today to try and get some perspectives on what are the leadership capabilities required. So what we did at Harvard is we wanted to try and get some real sense of how our leaders around us thinking about and making sense of what's happening. And we actually went out on a research, on a listening tour to CEOs, CHROs. In fact, some of them were also presenting today in other conversations across the world, and really try to understand from them how are they managing and leading through these times and how are they thinking about future. So what I'll try and do is really try and frame these thoughts in three areas. Number one, kind of set the context on what are the key shifts on business priorities, what is the implication of that on leaders, and what is the implication of that on leadership capabilities, and which is where I think probably is the most important part here, which is through research and findings, trying to understand what capabilities will be required as we come out of this pandemic. So, I'm perhaps preaching to the choir here, but as we look at the context around us, take any fundamental example or definition of what strategy is. And if you think of the forces that shape the strategy, they're actually changing. So if you look at the role of the government is very different to what it used to be 12 months or 11 months back. The role they are playing on the private sector is completely different. The competitive landscape is changing. Higher intensity of mergers and acquisitions. A lot of medium and small enterprises are going belly up. Yeah. If you look at the supply side, we've heard and read so much about the element of supply chain being more resilient rather than just sheer efficient. In some industries, there is a higher bargaining power of on the supplier side, and in certain sectors on the digital side and for certain specific skill set, there's actually a shortage of supply side. You look at cost of capital, it's perhaps the lowest we've seen in a really, really long time. And if you look at the demand side, the demand is dynamic depending on what industry you are in. Yeah. The consumer behavior is changing from moving away from premium definitions to going more towards value based buying behavior. And the global trade is gone down by 40%. So we've never seen this level of deglobalization ever. So if you and I are our CEOs and you're looking at 1 to 2 years down the line, demand you can't predict, supply side is changing dramatically, your customers' behavior and buying behavior is changing, the channel that they consume and buy on the digital side is changing, your competitive landscape is getting disrupted as we speak, and therefore how we operate, how we compete, and where we compete is bound to change. Now, just with that context, what we've done here is, as we were getting and hearing from various CEOs across industries, we really tried to put it into three buckets. And this is an HBR author, Professor Vijay Govindrajan, and he talks about these three boxes, and we've kind of taken an inspiration from there. These three boxes are things that he says, forget the past. We'll call it question the past for this conversation. Managing the present, what can we do right now, and creating the future. Now, we won't have time. This is a short conversation. We won't have time to go through all of that. But I'm going to try and highlight some of the key ones that require perhaps a little bit of comment. So the things that we have to question in the past. The big one is obviously the office. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this whole conversation around work from home, work from anywhere, and actually both are different. But I'll come to that in a separate slide. I think the bit that we have to question the past is around horizon-based strategy. Really the element of looking at strategy in a 1 year, 3 year, 5 year horizon really sounds archaic. The ability to have the luxury of alignment of communication from top to bottom through layers really sounds old, because the level of concurrent communication that exists from the top CEO to their front line has become so easy. The element around managing the present, cash is king. All business leaders and organizations know of that. The ability to connect with customers virtually, all of that is well spoken of. Couple of things as we think about creating the future. We know one specific skill that came across as really important during the pandemic and even now and perhaps in the future is the whole iterative business strategy. How do we create scenarios, decide on certain actions, and depending on which scenario is playing out, you lay that strategy out and execute that. Point being that there is almost, we've always kind of spoken about this whole design thinking mindset, but I think what came across is running businesses on a design thinking mindset became really important. And I think that's the entire element of agile budgeting, etc. The other one is on pace of digital adoption. No conversation can go without talking about that, but I'll share a very specific example to bring that to life, specifically what we learned from the China CEOs. The other one is organizations are realizing that the issues that we are facing, we don't have all the answers, and therefore working with other partners, competition, vendors, etc. All of that is extremely important to solve the problems and answer the questions that we are facing, and therefore leading in an ecosystem mindset becomes really, really important. So those are the kind of broad business implications, and what you can read on the slide are the big ones that are impacting all of us. Yeah. On work from home, I'll take a minute here, because there's so much out there on this. And Professor Prithviraj Chaudhary at HBS has done some research on that. And one key point is there is a difference between work from home and work from anywhere. Because what work from anywhere does is It opens up the limitations of geography. People can move to their hometowns, etc., and work. And you can just imagine the impact of gig economy, the impact of different folks getting into the workforce. It just opens up to a differently, a completely different ball game. And think of it as the outcome of that outcome. So the mega campuses, there is a question mark on that. There is reverse migration, the antidote to immigration challenges. And what you see on the slide here is what happened at the Silicon Valley, right? People used to come to San Francisco to work. Over time, it became really, really difficult. And what people did was, and this is what it became this long line of cities which started to get built. And then when there were issues on the immigration side, people started to work out of Canada in Vancouver, get the time advantage, and still be able to do that. So I think point being that the implications on the future of working are changing. And perhaps the important point here, as Prithviraj Chaudhary rightly says and writes about, is organizations figuring out and cracking the code on trust-based management. And I think so many times when we talk to our client organizations and CHROs, and especially in a lot of conservative organizations, they look at, hey, how do I manage performance as we work from anywhere? The other thing I want to talk about is I think there's also this perhaps misplaced over optimism around this work from home and work from anywhere. HBS has a separate unit which focuses on future of work. And in this particular one, the authors, and this is interesting because this is actually coming up in the next Harvard Business Review. And what it talks about is pre-pandemic, the office was there to do the mundane work. And post-pandemic, the role of the office or the role of the way our offices are structured is going to change dramatically. On a lighter note, it seems that hybrid word is perhaps going to be the word of 2021. Everyone's talking about it, but fundamentally, hybrid way of working is something that could be an interesting one to think about. What it means is, as organizations think of the future of work, what's the role offices will play is to build human connection, is to do the chance encounters, it's to get the randomness in your day-to-day life. What people are missing is that human connect, and therefore offices will primarily serve the place to renew social ties, to build learning culture, become the social anchor for an office, not to do your reviews. I mean, you'll be better off sitting at home or wherever to do those things, addressing mails, etc. But this is really to create and foster human moments. That's the role that will play. And that's why perhaps a lot of organizations are already talking about creating more hybrid ways of working. How can we not talk about the pace of digital adoption? And I'll perhaps give one example. And so much can be spoken about that just on this topic, but the speed, the importance of speed around organizations trying to go through digital transformation is extremely important. An example from China. This is a media company called Huanzi Media Group. They were to release a movie called Lost in Russia, and this was right before the Chinese New Year. And just at that time, the whole country went through a lockdown, a very strict lockdown, and they were not able to release that movie. What this group did was, within 24 hours, this group decided to release the movie on a platform. And this platform were the owners of TikTok. And they're interestingly released on the platform. They revised the business model on an advertisement business model. And they landed up reaching 600 million people and generating revenues of 97 million in just 5 or 6 days. Now think about that. All that happened in 24 hours. The point that I'm trying to say here is, in digital transformation, everybody talks about technology, etc. That's obviously important, but it's about the culture, it's about digital mindset, and therefore the speed of decision making, innovation that's required. So, having said all that, let me come to the part around, so what are the implications on a leader? And I'd urge you to just chat in your personal reflection on what is the biggest leadership shift you had to do personally during COVID times? Yeah, I'm going to look at these, look at your chats, but just love to hear from you as well. What is the biggest leadership shift you had to personally make? And let me kind of continue with what the research has to say. I think what came across really clearly is the polarities for leaders. On the top left, you'll see leaders had to fight to survive, do more with less. But we also know through research that organizations which have invested and innovated in the right areas, they have been able to come back to the growth curve much earlier. The distributed decision making was very high, but the need for virtual structure and process was also important at that time. There's so much spoken about need for attentive leadership, consistent communication, so on and so forth, but leadership has never been more remote. And one more thing that came out, leaders felt under a lot of pressure. Never in their lifetimes have any leader been exposed to so much. I mean, you're sitting in front of a camera and you're talking to thousands of your employees. Your every word, your every expression is being looked at. Just imagine the pressure on that leader. And obviously, we just spoke about the element of work from home, which is giving us flexibility, perhaps greater productivity in the short term, like what we just discussed in the research. But in the long term, there is research that's emerging that it's not all great. It has an impact on human connect. And obviously, we've seen so much around the blurring lines between work from home and work, creating to a lot of stressful situations. Now, if I go back to VG's model, so what are the implications? What are the questions of the past? I think some of them is kind of obvious. The micromanagement, the bureaucracy, it really needs to be thrown out. Um, this idea of management by presence. So number of hours I work in office equates to how hard I'm working. I mean, that's out for a toss, right? It was almost that there was this unbiased, unconscious bias earlier that if you were not serious about your career, you could work from home. There was this loosely thought thing. All of that has to be questioned. This management by presence is needs to be questioned. In terms of present, and that's the funny part, so many organizations, almost every organization, irrespective of whichever industry they would be, they kind of talk about this whole element of purpose. But I think what came out in our conversations and our interviews and through our research was purpose became this really important red thread to strengthen. And you know, companies kind of struggle. Like we as Harvard, I mean, we are not in the medical business. We are not out there in the front line trying to solve and help people. And what is the purpose that we kind of latched onto? We said, what do our learners and readers need to know more about, which will give them the best ideas to manage this crisis? And this is one way of for us to do that. So really purpose kind of became an important one. The second one, which I haven't highlighted, but it's really important. I mean, I remember few CEOs saying, you know, the big thing that I worry about is I'm going to listen about a news where somebody has committed suicide. The level of anxiety people had to go through has just been tremendous. You know, in China, research it came out that there's something called the emperor syndrome, where people who've been single child or small nuclear families, they've got all of that they wanted around their lifestyle, their lives, and now this was the first time they were going through some really tough times in their career. Some maybe getting laid off, some not getting their increments, some not getting their promotions, and just being lonely. So the whole element of resilience and managing ambiguity is a very important skill. The other one is around enhanced transparency and communication. And there is an HBS professor, Professor Nancy Cohen, and she puts it really beautifully. She says that in times like this, the leader needs to manage communication with two things: brutal honesty with credible hope. And I think that's really important. How do we, whatever is happening, we have to be brutally honest to everyone, yet come with a credible hope. So I think that's a little bit around managing the present. Now, if we go to creating the future, connect with your customers, continuous connections. We spoke about the adaptive strategy. You don't know the answer. And there is Professor Dutch Leonard. And Professor Dutch Leonard, he's done a lot of research on how do you lead during crisis and beyond that. And he says the big mindset shift is being okay to say I don't have the answers. Let's figure out in the next 3 months and 6 months. I think that's the level of agile planning and leading leaders need to do. We all know of a typical org structure, right? Now think of everything that we've spoken about, the element of management by presence. Think of the concurrent communication that's happening from top to bottom. Our typical org structure is that of a pyramid. There is a question mark on the role the mid management gets to play. Think about that, the outcome of the outcome. The top can talk to the front line very easily, very quickly. There is speed and pace. What is the role in the mid management that really exists? And what we are seeing early signs of trend is the top stays, a lot of mid management going into the front line and doing more customer facing or value adding roles that are getting created at the front line. And therefore, from a typical pyramid shape structure, we might start seeing the advent of a dumbbell shape structure. So the mid management getting thinned down, and a lot of companies are talking about delayering. So I think point of saying all this is we need to think of reimagining the org structure to enable speed. Yeah. And now the part which is really bringing it home, which is, so what are the capabilities required as we come out of this pandemic and lead our way back? And at Harvard, we kind of call it the pivotal leadership clusters. And the point here of whatever we can call it, but there are three key themes. And they're drawn in this manner for a reason. So the first one is around leading through uncertainty. This is a sense making cluster, really trying to understand, hey, how do I make sense of what's happening around me? The other one is cultivating trust. This is the inspiring cluster. So how do I kind of connect with the heart, the relational bond that I need to create as a leader? And the third one is reskilling for opportunities. This is the business cluster. And there is an overlap between cultivating and trust and reskilling, because there's a connect there, which I'll explain in a second. And leading through uncertainty over kind of covers both of them. So let me kind of bring this to life. So what is leading through uncertainty? This is a cluster where we're talking about how does a leader get comfortable in leading with ambiguity, can synthesize information quickly, can connect the dots, can can make sure that they are able to identify patterns even when the information is so little. So that's the leading through uncertainty. And how does a leader do that? It requires a very different, its own tool sets and skill sets. The element around developing personal capability. And this means questioning your business models, having a growth mindset, and really trying to ask yourselves questions and go back to fundamentals to be able to make those changes. So developing personal adaptability, navigating complexity. We know organization is a complex system. So to be able to manage that, and leading change. Now I know for years we always talk about leading change, but the leading change here is different. Leading change is different because of two things. One is the pace that's required is very, very different. And secondly, um, not knowing everything in the beginning is different. And I think therefore this leading through uncertainty is an important one. And team, remember, it's easier said than done. As a leader, we expect leaders to project a certain level of certainty in front of the entire team, which is not going to happen. So it requires that person to be vulnerable and say, I don't have the answers. I'm not going to project certainty because there isn't a certainty. And therefore, let's figure it out using these skill set. The other one is around cultivating trust. And this is the element of how do you engage? How do you demonstrate empathy, authenticity, be vulnerable, like I mentioned, to be able to create that connect with our employees and our team members. And this requires a person to genuinely be a great listener. So, what are the capabilities? I think the first one is inspiring engagement, using the power of purpose as a North Star and getting people excited on what you do. Valuing difference is such an important one, and it's not a function only that's happening in the US, etc. For because of racial reasons. I think across the world, I mean, we know so many clients are talking to us about that. Across the world, people are really talking about not just being tolerating differences. You almost kind of, people have seen this unconscious bias of hiring people who are like you and all of those issues. You know that, right? But celebrating differences, because that's where the growth happens. And I think it's such a hygiene point around communicating skillfully, but it is so important in this context. And this is about how do you, the right intent, the right clarity of communication, how do you tell the right stories, balance the element of advocacy and inquiry is really important. So as you think of the cultivating trust, those are the kind of skills that leaders would need to be successful in the as we come out of this pandemic. And the third one is around reskilling for opportunity. This is the business cluster, which is, this is the time to build skills, to look at new opportunities and get the team ready. And specifically the skills that we're talking about is innovation. So innovation is not something that's happening in an incubator or an R&D lab or in the periphery of business. Innovation is happening in the core. And why do you think this is overlapping the cultivating trust bit? Because for innovation to succeed, we very well know it requires the psychological safety, the comfort saying, hey, if I fail, it'll be fine. So fostering innovation is such an important one. In fact, I'll push this idea a little bit more to say that at HBS, there's something called, at the school, there's something called working knowledge, which is still not out there for public domain to read and listen to and podcasts, etc. The idea is that experimentative organizations is going to be the new gold standard. Now think of that. That's what's going to take organizations to be super successful. And that's why this becomes so important. And the other one is digital fluency. And team, it's not about technology that we have to get right, but it's about digital mindset. It's a very different mindset and requires a certain capabilities to manage that. So in summary, team, as we did this research, talking to CEOs, talking to professors, talking to HBR folks, really come out with the three clusters which leaders in your organizations, all of you require to think and reflect on are these: leading through uncertainty, cultivating trust, and reskilling for opportunities. And the question I'll leave you with is, as you reflect in your own organization, which out of these three clusters do you believe something that you need to work on? And even if you take that away, I think this is time well spent. So that's what I wanted to share from Harvard's perspective. Really, the big shifts in the business, implication for leaders, and leadership capabilities. I hope you found that valuable. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you, Mr. Hajani, for a precise presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, keep tweeting session highlights using the hashtag ETHRNexTech.